YouTubers. Today I'm going to talk to you about gaming from a female perspective. Most of my viewers are male, and many of you often express surprise or disbelief at my being female and also playing and discussing video games to the extent at which I do. So, for your sake, I figure I'd give you a little insight into what gaming is like from a female perspective, and why it's even a surprise to anyone that a girl would be interested in video games too. But before I get up on my soapbox and start saying my piece, I'd like to state outright that I'm not blaming men for the problems I'm about to discuss. The fault lies specifically in both marketing teams and game developers made up of both genders, so I'm not pointing fingers at everyone with a penis. Feminists, or at least the kind of feminist I am, do what we do because we want to be treated equally in both negative and positive aspects of life, and we want the same for men too. My interest is in human rights, not just rights for girls. I also consider myself a masculist. That said though, the gaming industry panders specifically towards men and boys, and as a girl this can be a little bit frustrating at times. Why? Well, let's start from the beginning, shall we?
Now, I was not alive for most of gaming history. My first console was a Nintendo 64. I do, however, take a pretty strong interest in retro gaming, so I've managed to glean from retro gaming magazines and websites that most early arcade games were played by more men than women. This probably has to do with the fact that historically, women have been restricted in the jobs that they've been allowed to hold, and that men tended to get the jobs that involve technology, or in this case, electronics such as computers. Women were less familiar with gadgets and whatnot because the role they were expected to play probably didn't allow them to have much access to them. This, of course, was beginning to change by the time electronic gaming entered the scene, but it wasn't until very recently that women began to have representation in the technological world. After all, how often have you heard people say, "There aren't any girls on the internet"? Regardless of the reason, though, women were rarely found in arcades. The first game to make a conscious effort towards attracting an audience of both boys and girls, however, was Pac-Man. Pac-Man's creator, Toru Iwatani, noticed that only boys were playing in the arcades and thought it would be profitable to expand the demographic. After all, women do make up half the population, so making gaming accessible to both genders would be a huge step towards making gaming mainstream in general. So he listened in on what women talked about with each other in a cafe, and found that women tended to talk about food. Thus he based the game around food, making Pac-Man a pizza, the enemies globs of ice cream, and the prizes different kinds of fruit. It was a huge success, attracting many players of both genders. This was a wonderful thing for girl gamers because it proved the reason more guys played games than girls was because of how games are marketed, not because guys and girls are so fundamentally different that they can't enjoy the same activities.
Unfortunately though, all that Pac-Man once stood for has been ruined. Why? Because they made a Mrs. Pac-Man.
Why is this a bad thing? Well, rather than inviting everyone to play, they now market the game specifically to girls. Making a female equivalent to Pac-Man told girls this is the version you're supposed to play, and effectively isolated girl gamers from every other game out there. Girls were only supposed to play the games that were made for them, but were excluded from the marketing of the games that were made for the general audience. Since games for girls are far and few between, this essentially made girls believe they were a minority in the gaming market, and shut them out. Rather than Miss Pac-Man being a conscious effort to represent women in the gaming industry, it caused a rift. Girl games were for girls. Every other game was for boys. Now, Mrs. Pac-Man may not have been the first game to do this, but the fact that it took a franchise that once stood for gender equality in the gaming industry and robbed it of what made it a success in the first place makes it even more frustrating. This is one reason gaming as a medium is not as mainstream a form of entertainment as movies, television, or even books. The representation of women in movies may not be perfect either, but it's far better than the representation of women in games. Women in games are either prizes to be won, sex objects, love interests, or just tokens. Few movies can pass the Bechdel test, and even fewer games can. And even if women were better represented, they're not marketed to. Games are marketed specifically to teenage boys and young men. This doesn't stop every girl from buying and playing them, but it tells the consumer crowd that only boys play games. It doesn't occur to them that girls play games too, because every game on the market, every commercial for every game, targets very exclusively the male demographic. The games always feature the manly men all the boys aspire to be, and the commercials always star a bunch of nerdy frat boys sitting around playing together. The ones that don't are advertised as kids' games, or party games, not games that are acceptable or fun for a college-age girl to play on her own. There are very few alternatives to choose from. If it's not a game designed for boys 13 to 18, it's a kiddie game with bright, colorful graphics, or an aerobics game designed for older adults. This is where the stereotypes begin to emerge. Girls generally tend to like the more colorful games for kids because they're in most cases the only alternatives to the male-oriented mainstream games. I personally enjoy games like Little Big Planet, where the method of empowering the player comes from creating your environment, not destroying it. Even though Little Big Planet is cute, I probably wouldn't enjoy it any less if it weren't bright or colorful. I just tend to gravitate towards colorful games because the only other options are the hyper-masculine combat games or the overly complex and tedious RPGs. This is why many female gamers are instantly written off as casual, because we're stuck with the games designed for people much younger than we are.
But seriously, you try collecting all 180 emblems in Sonic Adventure 2 Battle and then try telling me it's casual gaming.
What many marketing teams and developers don't realize is the female audience is already extremely present in the gaming industry. 80% of Nintendo console owners are female. Generally speaking, 40% of all gamers are female. And in the demographic of players 18 and over, they make up a significantly greater portion of the gaming population than men. The idea that girl gamers are rare, or even a minority anymore, is a huge misconception, perpetuated by the way games are marketed to the public. The problem is not that the girl gamer crowd isn't there. It's simply that there are a shortage of games marketed to suit their needs. The majority of games continue to pander to the male audience, even though there are, in most cases, just as many female players as there are male. For example, Portal is the only first-person shooter that doesn't feature men running around shooting other men, or aliens, whatever. The person wielding the portal gun is in fact a woman, and the environment she manipulates with it isn't cutesy or colorful, but it also doesn't take place on a desolate battlefield like so many other games within the genre, providing a more appealing method of empowerment to a wider audience. If more games were marketed to a general audience rather than just a male one, there wouldn't be this idea that playing video games is a boy thing. And going beyond just how the games are marketed, women could be better represented within the games themselves. If we had more Shells and fewer Lara Crofts, more Samus and less, Samus, the games themselves would be more inviting to play for most girls. Give us some representation with competent, fleshed-out characters. Having a vagina is not a character trait. Write characters as people and let the gender be inconsequential.
The gaming industry is still relatively young, though, and it has a lot of room to grow and make progress. Girls are getting more and more vocal about their presence in the gaming world, and because of this, the industry seems to be slowly changing to accommodate a more diverse audience. In the future, if these positive trends continue, it won't be necessary to identify oneself as a girl gamer anymore. I get a ton of comments from guys who claim they've never met a girl who plays video games. The truth is, though, you probably know one. The next time you're with your female friends, ask them if they ever play any games. You might be surprised by their answer.